everyone. Welcome again. I see some familiar faces already. My name is Fumi Olonishaki. I'm the Vice President and Vice Principal in charge of international matters at King's College London. It's my pleasure to welcome you here on behalf of King's and on behalf of the Georgian Papers Programme, which is a partnership of King's College London, the Royal Collection Trust, and our primary US partners, William and Mary, and the Omohundro Institute of Early American History and Culture. For those of you who were at the earlier event, you know what this is all about. But everyone is about to get some fundamental, have some fundamental relationship with this program, which you'll be introduced to in a minute by my colleagues. My pleasure to welcome Arthur Barnes, Professor Arthur Barnes at King's, and Professor Karen Wood. Please, over to you. Thank you so much. You're welcome.
Well, thank you for me. Karen and I are going to act as kind of super MCs for the evening. We're going to be guiding a conversation among our distinguished panel. But I think just before we get started, I just want to say a couple of things about the programme. The Georgian Papers Programme really has been a very exciting experience for both Karen and I and for lots of people involved with it. And one of the things that's been most exciting about it is the ability we've found to make connections, not just from the academic world, but outside the academic world as part of that. And that's particularly, I think, important to us, because one of the things we like about the Georgian Papers is the chance it gives us to think through big issues, not just about the 18th century, but things that feel very germane at the moment in our own times. And tonight, really, I think, is one of those occasions. The mental illness of George III has already generated about 200 years of interest from scholars, not just historians, but also doctors. In fact, one of the weirdest things that I didn't know until we started thinking about this was, who do you think was the first person ever to write an academic paper about George III? Well, you'd think it would be an English historical review, tweeded English gentleman. Well, it wasn't. It was this man, Isaac Ray, who was an American psychiatrist, who was in fact in charge of an American mental hospital, and he delivered the first academic paper ever on George III, on George III's illness, to the annual conference of American heads of psychiatric institutions in 1855. And that paper remains the keynote discussion of the subject for almost 90 years, and then in the 1940s, Manfred S. Guttmacher, another American psychiatrist, wrote a 400-page study of the madness of George III, and he was the first person to get into the Royal Archives to actually look at the documents and the doctor's papers. Astonishing that he was able to gain access to those. And if you're interested by all of that, you're lucky, because we have done an exhibition in association with tonight's event, which has gone live this afternoon, which you're invited to inspect on the Georgian Papers website, which again has undergone a spring clean for the occasion, with new pages. And in this exhibition, we've produced some new documents about the madness of George III, but also on the last page, so get to the last page, there's a full timeline of scholarship on the madness of George III and a full bibliography, which I think covers everything published from the psychiatric historians who've worked in it since the 1850s. So that's our background. We just found it really interesting. But what we want to do tonight is to try and have a more varied conversation, not just about historians. In fact, what's interesting about George III is the way it's been the subject of exchange between historians, doctors, and increasingly performers, because of the importance of Anne Bennett's play, which I think for many of us is the point of entry to this whole subject. And last year we had the pleasure of working with Mark Gatiss and Adam Pemford at Nottingham Playhouse as they were working on the staging, talking about the documents with Simon. We went to discuss them as well. So we've been having a conversation already about this, and we thought we'd try and carry that on this evening, and to take a variety of perspectives on this quite extraordinary individual and his life experiences. So for tonight we have a range of speakers. I won't spend long introducing them. You know who I am, Arthur Barnes, and I'm not even a speaker, I'm just a compere for tonight. But the others we have Barbara Taylor, Professor of Humanities at Queen Mary at the University of London. We have Alan Penford, the artistic director of Nottingham Playhouse, who also was the director of this extraordinary production. If you haven't seen it, and you ever get a chance to see it, you'll get a brief snippet tonight. Do see it. And we have Mark Gatiss, who played George III with extraordinary power. I was in the theatre and saw it. I then saw it again on NTLive, and my word, it was worth seeing twice. It's provoked so much thought about it for me since I saw that production. And then I think Karen is going to introduce others.
Yes, so it is wonderful to see all of you this evening. I think what Arthur has set me up to say is that apparently Americans since the mid-19th century have been obsessed with the madness of King George. Anyway, it is my great pleasure to introduce Mike Brown, who's reader at the University of Roehampton and a cultural historian of medicine, and Sir Simon Wesley, who is professor of psychiatry at the Institute of Psychiatry at King's, past president of the Royal College of Psychiatry, and director of the King's Center for Military Mental Health Research. I also want to acknowledge two extraordinary and distinguished scholars who are in the audience with us tonight and who have been instrumental in our understanding of the Georgian world and also in contributing to the Georgian Papers Programme. One of those is Amanda Vickery, professor of early modern history at Queen Mary, who gave luster to the GPP in its very first public lecture on her research into the Georgian political day, and Flora Fraser, author of numerous important books, and for me especially, as she knows, I always say the Georgian Princesses, and a fellow of the GPP for Mount Vernon, and a member of the GPP Academic Steering Committee. So a quick note about format. We are intending to have a quite informal conversation, which Arthur and I will guide, with directing questions to our panel. We intend this to be a brisk and intense conversation, and we hope you enjoy it very much.
So you thought you did actually ask Mike actually the question just to begin with, because obviously this is a play about doctors and patients. And just to begin actually with the doctors, in a few minutes we're going to see a clip from the production where we see Dr. Willis, the mad doctor in Lincolnshire, coming to engage with George III. And I wonder if you could just set the scene for us a bit by telling us a little bit about what an assignment was in the 18th century, and what the difference was between a doctor like Willis, a provincial mad doctor, and the royal physicians that otherwise were engaged with George III.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, it's important, I think, for those of you, I mean, people might have different kind of knowledge of this period, but it's important to stress, first of all, I think, that medicine in this period, there is no National Health Service, there is no kind of state medicine. And medicine is fundamentally an individualistic enterprise. So all these doctors are kind of in it for themselves by and large, and their sense of fellow feeling or identity with their colleagues may be limited. So in a sense, they're all in competition with each other, and one sees this, I think, very much in the kind of relations between the doctors in attending George III. I mean, Willis is an interesting character in many ways because he's both an outsider from London, relatively speaking, but he's also say a part of a profession in mad doctoring that is itself in this period, if not sort of looked down upon, but certainly marginal. Now, it's really in the 18th century that madness, and I'm using the term advisedly. I'm using the contemporary term, the actors category. We wouldn't necessarily call it that today, but they would have called it that at the time. That madness was treated as a kind of distinct condition. And it was treated in a variety of ways, largely in the most part by physical treatment. So increasingly madness is seen as something which is treatable, but often in ways that resemble the treatment of other physical ailments. So things like bleeding, purging, blistering, those kinds of things. But increasingly in the 18th century, one gets the establishment of specialist institutions, asylums. The oldest, of course, is Bethlehem, followed in mid-18th century by St Luke's, which cater specifically for the care of the mad. And in Willis's case, he's an interesting example because he's part of what is sometimes known as the trade in lunacy, or the kind of mad trade in the 18th century. So these are kind of, as it were, entrepreneurs who set up their own institutions to cater for paying clients who may, one thing that's characteristic about the treatment of madness in this period, and it's been argued for a variety of reasons, that whereas families might have taken care of these individuals themselves in the past, in the 18th century they're increasingly handing that care over to other people who claim to be specialists, and Willis is a classic example of this. Someone who sets up an institution in Lincolnshire, as say in provincial England, and gains something of a certainly local and actually also national reputation because he's also a visiting physician to a London asylum. So he's sort of an outsider, provincial in some ways, but not completely marginal.
That's so interesting that you raised. First of all, let me just ask if everyone can hear all of us. Is the audio? Yeah. Okay, good. The audio portion of our program, right? Okay, good. Very good. So it's so interesting that you raised this question of the provincial versus the metropolitan. Barbara, we wanted to ask. You've written so powerfully about the sense of 18th century self and the emergence of ideas about self and reason, unreason, the relationship there. And is there a kind of provincial and metropolitan quality to the kind of 18th century sense of self as well that might play into what Mike is talking about in terms of Willis being a kind of provincial doctor who comes to London?
I don't think I can answer the question quite as you framed it about provincial versus metropolitan, except perhaps to say that of course, the elites are where great force for changes in ideas about what constitutes correct, if we can say, forms of selfhood or subjectivity. And I think, listening to Mike, what I was thinking about is how the boundaries of what is considered mad and these definitions undergo much change in the course of the 18th century. And there are forms of, they undergo change in their boundaries and also in causation, in the sense that, ways of thinking about the self in general that are religiously framed are beginning to give way to more naturalistic understandings of selfhood. And madness is very much affected by that. Madness is a mark of the devil in earlier periods, and now that begins to give way to much more thinking about what we would call psychological factors. So the question of reason and unreason begins to take on new sort of meanings, I think, in that changing environment, and in that secularization, slow secularization of ideas about the self.
So we're about to go to the clip here, and Adam, I wondered if you. So we're doing a lot of stage setting, as you can see here. Asking about background a little bit. And Adam, what we wanted to ask you to do is to set up this clip for us a bit and help us to understand what we're about to see as Dr. Willis, the King, and the Prime Minister, in a sense, are each reflecting on the nation, the kind of the nature of madness and caretaking, or maybe that's how I'm reading it. I don't know. I wonder if you could just help us to see what you want us to see in this clip.
Yes, I'm trying to remember what clip it is you're about to
We're at Q.
We're at
We told you this.
that was your cue. Yeah, that's my cue. That's sorry. It's the breakthrough moment, really, isn't it? When they've taken him out to Kew, which is the freezing palace, the palace that George III hated. And they've taken him out there in the middle of winter on Christmas Day, I seem to remember. Christmas Day. Yeah, Christmas Day. And Willis starts to break him in as you would break a horse, effectively. And it's the moment that it feels like the fever breaks, in my mind. Is that what you remember, Mark, in terms of that?
Yes, but it's, as you say, it's the sort of, well, it isn't working, and the other doctors are starting to gang up on him.
Yes.
Drama anyway, and it is a sort of kill or cure principle, isn't it? So that's sort of the clip.
Sharp, the king. Not here. Not here. She is not here. What have you done with her? She will be at Kew, you said.
It is not time. You are not fit to meet her yet.
It's a lie. Not fit? You're an ordained minister and you told me a lie. Well, that lie, sir, will have you out of a living. That lie will have you out of that famous farm of yours and loose your tamed lunatics across Lincolnshire. Liar, liar.
Hush, sir, hush. Her Majesty is here at Kew. And when you learn to conduct yourself properly, you shall see her.
Mendacious old fool.
Oh, cheer up, Georgie boy, me old love.
You rascal.
Oh, God, how he stings.
You slack-ass drizzle prick.
I've had enough of this foolishness. Come to your senses, sir.
I cannot come to my senses. I have to go to them. I cannot go to them because I'm fastened here.
Now that we are safely in our new abode, shall we give thanks? Let us pray.
How can I? I cannot put my hands together.
Prayer is an attitude of the soul.
Bollocks! You have to put your hands together or it doesn't signify.
O God, knowest us to be set in the midst of great dangers, that by reason of the frailty of our nature we cannot always stand upright.
Yes, and why, liar?
Grant to us such strength and protection as may support us in all dangers and carry us through all temptations. Through Jesus Christ our Lord.
Amen. Liar!
Amen.
I was not expecting you, sir.
Why, it's Tuesday, my customary day.
It's Christmas Day.
Is it? It's all one to me. Handier, Q.
Colder.
It's the summer palace.
Summer palaces, winter palaces. I am not up in such matters, but I would have protested had I known. Sweats and fevers in such a cold place will do him no good. It is a tomb. I wonder the Prince of Wales does not appreciate that.
I used to sit with my father too. Hours at a time, he would not speak. When he was well, he would read Shakespeare to the family. When it came to the comic parts, he handed the book to me.
I have never read Shakespeare. I'm a clergyman.
Mark, I'd like to ask you a little bit about what for you was going on there.
Terror.
How far
Mostly terror.
how far in the sense that the George III you're seeing at that point in the play is still the same man that we begin with at the start of the play, and how far, or whether there's some fundamental change that's taking place, and what did you draw on for that performance? What were your sources for the physicality and the approach to the lines? Because they're highly written lines, aren't they, that you get from Bennett there to work with?
It was a fascinating process, obviously, because you have to start with the text. It's not, I was talking to Mike about this, about the telescoping of the drama, the conflation of certain characters. The doctors are lots of different doctors. They become emblematic doctors. The drama itself takes place over a sort of shortened period of time. But so you have to start with Alan's play, and then inevitably, when it was first written, the diagnosis, as it were, was porphyria, wasn't it? And that's somewhat being debunked now. So in rehearsals, it was sort of like, well, and talking to Simon, no one really knows what it is. So, which of course gave me an incredible license to do what the hell I liked. But also, it's a strange thing this for me, because I was brought up opposite a psychiatric hospital where my father worked, and I spent all my life batting away the question about how it has affected my life and work. Growing up opposite this perfectly ordinary hospital, which has now assumed the proportions of Arkham Asylum from Batman, and was not a gothic monstrosity, but weirdly, in this instance, it was genuinely very useful. And I mean, it was a colony. We used to have our haircut there. We used to go swimming there. We used to go to the cinema there. It was as natural as breathing to us to be in the hospital, and I knew a lot of people, and they based a lot of that on those people I knew when I was a child, particularly the ticking and certain parts of the repetitive behaviour and things like that. Because I thought, well, there's an awful lot actually to draw on there. But I suppose because it isn't, because we don't know, we just don't know whether it was some sort of cataclysmic breakdown or a physical illness or all these things. It was very interesting to me to be able to draw on that sort of palette, I suppose, as an actor of different illnesses and different influences.
That leads up to a question we were going to ask Adam in any case, which is, how important is the diagnosis to what you do this in the play, or does it not matter at all why George III was unfair?
It's a really interesting. I mean, I think it's what Mark says, that you have to slightly go back to Alan's play, because we're really there to serve his play, and that's got to be the starting point. But actually, you can go one step further back than that, because we know that Alan read The Royal Malady. And got quite a lot from that. So I read back through that, which I think some of that's been debunked. Has it a little? Yes, yeah. But that was certainly something that Alan heavily drew upon when he wrote the play in the 90s. So I used a bit of that, and that slightly I mean, when you're directing an actor, what you're trying to do is allow that actor to get to the heart of the character. So basically work out what their motivation is. Why are they doing the things they're doing? And I think this hints that Alan thinks that through years of suppression of his true self, because of his royal connection, and actually, interestingly, now you get this in The Crown. They're exploring exactly the same thing in the TV series The Crown. It feels like he suppressed his sexual appetite, he suppressed his true personality, and eventually it feels like that bursts out in Technicolor. And I think that's what Alan was getting at. Now, how you diagnose that, I've no idea. I'm a theatre director. But it's about trying to get to the heart of the truth of what Alan was getting at, I think.
So that's the slight follow-up question we had, I think, two of you. Should we feel sorry for George? And how should we emotionally, as an audience, align ourselves with him and those trying to treat him? It's a bit difficult, I think, when you read back some of the history, to know quite how to understand it, and Karen may want to say something.
Well, only in the sense that part of what you're describing about how he's, he represses and then he kind of blows up. But some of the ways in which he blows up, we were talking about beforehand. There's more aggression to it. It's more than inappropriate behavior. But but I actually wanted to bring Simon in on this point about the history of psychiatry and whether George III, who is, I mean, from our perspective as historians, we think, and just literally right after he dies, I think 1820 is the first account, right? But people are starting to analyze, this particular malady. Is George III a kind of landmark case in the history of psychiatry? Is there anything, as historians we think, this seems like a case that you can really use to track the history of psychiatry, in the Alpine stuff. But do you think of it that way, or
No, we don't.
Yeah.
Actually. I'm sorry, but we don't. But first of all, I was thinking about what you were saying. You were describing a world in which physicians and surgeons ruled the roost and treated all the rich people, despised psychiatrists and anyone who came from the north. And I really thought we were talking about history, but clearly we're not. Clearly we're not. I would say two things. First of all, whilst it's pretty true now that I don't think the diagnosis of porphyria, a particular metabolic disorder, is sustainable as understanding George's illness, but I don't think it matters very much at all. What's clear is that he had mania, and that's just indisputable, and we still see mania to this day. And all we're really arguing about is the cause. And McAlpine and Hunter, a doctor and a historian, no, they were both doctors, weren't they? Yeah, they were both doctors. They decided that it was the cause as an organic disorder of the endocrine system. And actually all of this, to understand that, you don't understand, it's not about the 18th century, it's about the 1960s in psychiatry when they're writing, where the big names were R.D. Laing, who says that schizophrenia is due to parents, and then Saz says that mental illness anyway is a complete myth, which is quite a tall order, but he did. And Goffman is saying that if we get rid of the institutions, we'll get rid of mental illness. It turns out that actually we did get rid of the institutions, but we didn't get rid of mental illness. They react to that in a somewhat eccentric way, but really to claim back a different tradition in psychiatry, that it's about a disorder of the brain, it's an organic disorder. I think we all think they got the wrong one. But we do think that these very severe mental illnesses are ultimately partly rooted in some form of brain. Yeah. And you say, should we feel sorry for the king? I mean, yes, of course we should. And so what it's describing in the play and is clearly mania. And the argument is, well, most of us think we don't really know the cause yet. And one or two said, we do know the cause, but they did it for a political reason. And the other reason they did it, which may sound a bit strange, but was to actually remove the taint of mental illness from the royal family. The royal family have had to try to bring that back in again, haven't they? But anyway, but they did. And they really genuinely felt that they were doing them a favour. Most of us think, really, we should just be trying to reduce the stigma of psychiatric disorders. And by simply taking one illness out of the psychiatric calendar, as it were, we don't, at the moment we're arguing about autism, but it won't make any difference to what we might call the facts on the ground.
I think we should feel sorry for him as a person, not as a king. That to me is, I mean, the reason it's incredibly famous, because he was the king, but he would not have been allowed to get away with half of what he did if he hadn't been the king. To me, it's not dissimilar to the King's Speech, that movie. I don't care that he was the king. It's a moving story about a person who can't deal with his speech impediment. And I rather hated the fact it was dressed up as, it doesn't matter, this big speech he's got to make. If he'd been making a speech to a town council and he couldn't do it, it would be equally moving. I think that obviously the case has just attracted all this because he was the King of England, and I find that sort of sociologically rather interesting. The case has become this emblematic thing simply because of its royal connection, but as a person, my God, of course, it's a terrible thing.
But it's interesting, isn't it? Because you say, he wouldn't have got away with things except if he was the king. But, when we think about the royal family more recently, we also think that in fact having psychological problems of one kind or another, and what we seem to be witnessing quite often is how ruthlessly people are now treated, where they come under the spotlight, and everything that someone might quietly get on with seeking treatment and help for is, so with Princess Diana, with Harry, and it seems to me that it's a really interesting question that George III bringing it forward in time raises, which is about the relationship between publicity, the place that people, and how the world of publicity has changed, and how that relates to the question of psychological distress. Because in a way, we are all much more public people now. Our problems are played out, on screen, in social media, and how much is that exacerbating problems, which we see, I find very poignantly with young people like Prince Harry and Meghan right now, or in the case of Diana.
It's interesting that, talking about how should we feel sorry for them, it's clear that, obviously people at the time did, and what's really kind of comes through, I think, in for example, the Greville diary, is that kind of pathos of his condition. And there's a wonderful moment where Willis first turns up and the king is introduced, and according to Greville, you almost get the sense that he now realises that he's mad, or that he's been regarded as mad, because, they were mad, there's a mad doctor there, and he has to go to his doctors because he says, you didn't tell me what was really wrong with me. And then he says something at the line is, the poor king, overcome by his feelings, burst into a flood of tears and wept bitterly. As melancholy but interesting was the scene. There's a kind of, of course, this is the age of sensibilities, and this is it's couched in those terms. But clearly, there's this real sense of pathos at his sort of distress, of kind of being realising that actually they're mad, or they think they're mad.
Could we link a couple of things that several of you have touched on here, which is the relationship between stress and publicity and stigma. So your point was that there's a searching out of physiological explanation because of the stigma of mental illness. Barbara, you mentioned that the spotlight, essentially, the harsh spotlight, produces stresses which may actually be exacerbating people's mental health. I mean, it may be corroding people's mental health. Is it in part because the stigma is around caring for one's mental health? In other words, what role is publicity, the spotlight, pressure, etc., and what role is stigma here in mental?
I'll kick off. I mean, we're pretty clear that stressful life events can precipitate or trigger episodes of madness. Okay, but we don't think they cause it. We think they're the trigger, and indeed, in George's life, his final illness seems to be precipitated by the death of one of his daughters. But that doesn't mean that's the cause. Okay, and the general view, it would have happened anyway, but it brings it forward. Talk about brought forward time. You cannot simply stress someone into insanity. You can stress them into post-traumatic stress disorder that I deal with, or depression, but it's actually not true to say, or they do in novels, that you drive someone insane. That's pretty much a literary fiction.
Well, at another occasion, you and I might have a long discussion. Because I'm not at all persuaded that the psychiatric illness is a broken brain. But I think the category of stress is perhaps a rather crude one. I mean, which is not to say that there isn't plenty of stress around and that doesn't make a difference. And I do think that, I mean, this is a Sapiens maybe very off-piste here, but, you know, the world that we inhabit right now, and the degree of publicity that we all experience, in a sense, that there is a way of having to self-project, which, you know, is quite novel. And my sense is that we're actually going through a revolution of subjectivity, and we are feeling the consequences of that in ways that we don't understand yet. And I think conversations like this, looking back to George and how moving that story is, are ways of maybe opening up the conversations.
Okay. Why don't you push you, Mark, as you move through the arc of the play, where does this issue of stigma shape coming to your sense of what George is feeling about it as he moves towards the end of the play? Because there's the kind of happy ending version of the end, isn't there? The apotheosis at St. Paul's, but also there's obviously a new degree of self-knowledge, because George clearly is someone who has that capacity to recognise, and there's that extraordinary letter he sends to Pitt after the 1788 denial of saying, I'm going to have to take it easy now, and I do realise I've been difficult to work with there for the last 6 months, which is an extraordinary letter for a monarch sent to the Prime Minister. It's very self-aware. Where do you think he is at the end of this process?
Well, it's you know, for a monarch to have to be that human. I mean, I love the fact that they dismiss the loyal servants. It seems completely correct. That's what you must understand, that you've been incredibly loyal. Goodbye, because that's not how monarchy works. I think that's just feels so completely correct, and you can't see royalty in its soiled underclothes and survive, as it were. So, but he clearly, as a person, I think, has been on an extraordinary journey to self-awareness, but there's also there's a point in the play where he starts to play them a bit, and I found that very interesting. He clearly starts to play with this, and he's going, I'm not quite sure you're as mad as you say you think, and he's as a lot of, using the word, a lot of mad people become quite sly, and I remember that from my childhood. There was a lot of people that I knew that my dad would say, you watch it, and he's clever, he's crafty. That's what he's crafty, that one. And so there's a lot of that comes into play. And then by the end, he has to reassert his credentials as an absolute constitutional monarch, and yet be aware that a lot of people around him have seen him in the altogether. And in terms of stress, that must have a residual effect. You can't just put the genie back in the bottle, and of course it comes out again.
There's a wonderful thing that comes through in some of those very early writings, I think most of the 19th century discussion, where one of the things why the American psychiatrists are interested is this tells us something about how leaders, how we will have to deal with the leader if our president shows signs of mental.
Could you digitise that, please?
In English mental health law, when I was president of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, I was the only person who could detain the Prime Minister. That's true. And I told this to this is true, it's in the Act. I can't now because I'm not president. I only found out a month ago. But I told that to my American counterpart over dinner, and she got very, very excited. Went back to the US, and unfortunately they have no such. You need permission of the Speaker.
Can I just say, it's really interesting with us, what comes across in Sunday Archive is that, the king is himself conscious of the stigma. So, he says, I can't show my face, I can't go outside, I'm going to have to retire to Hanover, where of course he'd never been, sort of, and hide away. And then later I think he's playing cards or something with Lucas Pepys and Greville, and he says, just decide, just think of it, a king in a straight waistcoat, and he's sort of conscious of how awful this is for his kind of reputation, for his standing, even in the midst of his kind of his mania.
But there's a curious other bit of reticence we've noticed, just again looking at the materials tonight. If you were trying to find cartoons of the king as mad in this world of extremely brutal ad personam satire, there's none.
Really?
There's no satire. There are satires of a king in his sickbed being prayed for, or of a quiet old man who can't see fading away, but nothing that seems to play. It's almost he wasn't felt there's no way to picture this.
It's too technical.
Makes
Yeah.
sense.
I wondered if we could go back to this question of stigma versus how a monarch is expected to behave. And I wonder if you felt like you were experiencing that sense of stigma, whether you were reflecting on, I've got to be the king so they can't see me in this situation, or whether you were feeling the weight of stigma that was just sort of surrounded kind of madness generally.
That's a very tough thing to answer, really, because you have to think of the journey through the play for the character, but and also that you're in an impossible position. None of us have ever been king, and you don't know what on earth it must be like. What must that be like? And also they were a long way past divine right, but they were still so other, even more than we can even conceive today. And so to fall from that Olympian height must have, I mean, psychologically, it's extraordinary damaging, mustn't it? And then to feel like we're saying he wouldn't have got away. He got away with an awful lot of stuff, but then was treated with incredible brutality.
Yes, indeed.
So that sort of juxtaposition of things must have been so alarming as well. It's like, well, I'm not aware that I'm going mad, and then suddenly the mad doctor turns up, and it's like, it's terrifying, you know. So that must have been. I mean, in terms of stigma, it's like no one has ever done this to a king before.
So he's kind of given latitude in a sense of being the monarch, but then also his illness matters in a way that other people's illnesses doesn't matter, right? I mean, we'll give or take in terms of the state, so the politics behind it and the need for him to get better and those kind of pressures maybe aren't quite as profound for other people in that position.
That's the thing, is that, I mean, obviously within the play and in reality there's a lot of politics, because the Prince of Wales faction is suddenly in the ascendant, but more than anything, the state is sick if the head of state is sick. I think that's clear, and especially in the 18th century, I'd say they are very conscious of what that must have looked and feel like.
Just turn back a bit to Dr. Willis and what he thinks he's confronted here, because I think one thing that comes through very strongly is his focus on affront and moral indiscretion or moral trespass by the king as a focus for his control here. And I just wonder about where that stands in the understanding of what's wrong with him from the doctor's point of view. How far is it about him transgressing as opposed to being ill that we're trying to cure him?
Yeah, I mean, it's very interesting. There are so many. One thing that's important to suggest is, now, in order to kind of make a name for yourself as a psychiatrist, you publish, right? That wasn't the case in the 18th century. So one of the leading psychiatrist, sort of mad doctor of 18th century London, John Monroe, a physician of Bedlam, basically published nothing in his life. He didn't need to. He was a physician of Bedlam. He saw what he needed to see, and he got expertise from that. But he basically said at one point in time, we will never understand madness. We'll never understand what causes it, and there's no point trying to understand it effectively. There are other people who try and construct a kind of nosology of it. William Batty, the wonderfully named William Batty, famously, who has got two types of madness. One is original, i.e. you're kind of born with it, the seeds of it, and the other is accidental, so it's caused by grief, disappointments, and these kinds of things. So there is definitely a sense that it is. There is certainly a sense that it is a physical condition, by and large. How you treat that, again, varies very much from individual to individual, and also varies over time. So what you get, you see this with the treatment of George, that he's treated both kind of physically, as you would any disorder, blisters, purges, those kinds of things, and also with what Willis kind of is increasingly termed moral management towards the end of the 18th century. And Monroe practiced this as well. I mean, Monroe talks about management being more important in a way than cure. And that is a kind of complete emotional, psychological, and physical domination of your patient. And Willis is a really fascinating character for kind of how he's represented in the history of psychiatry. Is he progressive? Because he's moving towards seemingly psychological models. Actually, but he's putting people in straight waistcoats and very, very kind of aggressively dominating them. And actually, he's a kind of interesting relationship with the kind of later moral therapy, the kind of Chooks and others, which is trying to do away with restraint in when it can. So in a sense, I think he's managing the king's condition through kind of a form of suggestion and through kind of, you will conform, you will find yourself again, you will return to yourself, you will sort of, you lost yourself. And I think but it isn't to say I would hesitate to say it's a psychological understanding of madness. I think for them, madness is still rooted fundamentally in the body, in humours, in those kind of balances, and not in a kind of notion of a capacious mind with, either neurophysiological or kind of psychological.
But we should say in his defence that it's fairly clear that the physicians were the one killing the king. They were giving him drugs that were toxic and poisonous, they were blistering that was leading to infections in a day with antibiotics, and he himself thought that. And indeed, I think immediately later on actually gave Willis some award or some honour or something.
He got £1,000 from the government.
And he didn't give anything to the physicians because he hated them, because they were the ones who were making his life a misery, and indeed, had they continued, probably would have killed him.
He didn't much like Willis either, though. He called him a rascal, didn't he, and those kinds of things.
That's okay, that's quite kind.
There's a wonderful line when he says, in the same conversation where he's talking to Pepys about King in the Straight Waistcoat, he says, what does he say? All is fair, tricking in love and physic, as you know, is all fair. So he calls kind of Willis a rascal, but accepts that the trickery that Willis is playing on him is kind of necessary for his kind of getting better.
You asked if George III is talked about much, in canons. We talk about psychiatry, not very much really until the McAlpines, and then of course still Alan Bennett. But Willis is talked about for one thing only, because it was the first time that the elite, the Royal College of Physicians, actually admits that they're stuck, and they bring this man down for what we would now call a second opinion, I guess. And that's the first time that's happened, really, and to the most illustrious patient in the kingdom. And so that is quite an important moment. It's the first time they still don't recognise psychiatry in any shape or form, but it's still something that changed, that they're not quite as despised as they had been previously.
To come back to what you first asked about provincialism, for example, it's important to stress that although he is provincial, he's still, I think it's a Cambridge, I forget it's Oxford or Cambridge, but he's a graduate of the English universities, in that sense isn't that much of an outsider compared to some, contemporary.
Yeah, he's in Lincoln.
Yeah. But then again, a lot of the King's physicians start off in provincial practices in Lincolnshire, and actually Lincolnshire seems to be a bit of a running theme.
What did you say? Is it not quite as despised? I don't know how that is as an epitaph. They're not quite as despised.
We're still very low down the food chain, even to this day.
But not quite as despised.
Yes.
Right. So I wanted to come back to a little bit of a theme about gender, and start with asking Barbara about whether stigma and sense of self, whether it's Margaret or whether it's the King, whether this kind of sense of madness and a sense of shame about madness would have been, or how, I guess, would it have been influenced by someone's sense of gender and their gendered responsibilities. And the King is a king, but he's also a man. And how might that have played a role?
Well, I mean, women were sort of nuttier by nature, 18th century thinking. I mean, female reason is weaker. Imagination, the imagination is a very controversial faculty in the 18th century. Their imagination is stronger. Sensibility, which by and large is valued, sensitivity, empathy, in women is excessive. They're ruled by their emotions. So the sense that that women live on a brink very often, and I think that way of construing femininity. I should add that it also, I mean, the whole notion of living on the brink of madness also plays quite a fashionable part. We haven't discussed this, but I mean, this is a real element in 18th century thinking about subjectivity, is that high sensitivity and nervous disposition is a sign of refinement. Yes. And but the problem is that in women it becomes excessive. So you don't want to be crude, you don't want to be insensitive, you don't want to be dull. So, I mean, people are really walking a very fine line a great deal of the time. And a lot of behaviors, and I think we must not forget the significance of religion. Because although I mentioned sort of secularization of attitudes, in fact, this is still a society saturated in religious thinking. So a lot of behaviors that we now might feel concern about, very, very intense, obsessional forms of spiritual involvement or whatever, are looked upon quite differently still in the 18th century, and indeed perhaps still today. I mean, I don't know, but I mean, so women, but always what it is that women are always having to negotiate the question of extreme, of where things are not being offset, by masculine sturdiness of character and reason and so on. So femininity is a stigmatized condition, I think we could say, and I think so. But also, I mean, when women went crazy, I mean, it was then treated very often as a manifestation of extreme femininity, and indeed, there's all these categories of hysteria and so on, which are specific to it. This is not entirely a thing of the past. I think it's safe to say. I mean, the relationship between psychiatry and gender remains a very complicated one.
Something to say about religion as well. I mean, the association, the relation between religion and madness in this period, as I say, quite complex. And when William Black puts his statistics of the admissions into Bethlehem Asylum in the early 19th century, very early 19th century, one of the causes elicited of madness is Methodism. So Methodism is in itself a form, and it's actually a form of madness. That kind of excessive emotionality, that kind of is seen as actually a kind of manifestation.
But on the other side, if we go to this wonderful William Blake exhibition, we see ideas about sublime.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And Blake himself, I mean, the celebration of the notion of the sublimity of reaching out to the transcendent. Experience, speaking with angels.
There's a fine line between the visionary and the man.
As there always was. I mean,
I wanted to follow up a little bit about the question about gender and asking about the Queen, and how you interact with her and why you interact with her the way you do, and if you have a sense of there are these moments when you're asking for her and other moments when you're embarrassing her with Lady Pembroke. And I guess I wanted to, it's sort of a little bit like the question that Arthur asked about, are you the same man at the end of the play as you are at the beginning, just having experienced something intense in the middle? Do you ever come back to your relationship with the Queen at the end? Do you have this sense of like, I've returned to myself and I've returned to this relationship with the Queen? Or is just kind of a broken relationship there?
No, not at all. I mean, we spent a long time thinking about that. And again, what she sees and chooses not to see, and what she knows that other people are seeing and saying, she's kept away, which is just so cruel. And yet at the same time, because of what's going on, he's incredibly cruel to her. It's this dreadful sort of feeling of saying the unsayable, but then that's part of that, that thing we're all familiar with relatives who the veils are going, the filters are going, and they suddenly say the thing they're not supposed to say. I just want to say this just because it popped into my head. I was talking to a friend of mine who works for an LGBT charity for older gay people, and this is like a new phenomenon. They are dealing constantly with people who have been closeted all their lives, who are suddenly losing all their inhibitions, and people who aren't even out are getting dementia and suddenly making passes at people but just declaring themselves. It's almost like a new way. It turned a strange corner. Isn't that a fascinating idea? That so there's stuff going on there. They're private and very happy and successful marriage, Mr. and Mrs. King. Very, that like sort of Scandinavian model of a little. They're actually just fine and happy together. Hundreds of children. And they've been through terrible grief, but they're really a solid unit of not very attractive people. That's the truth. They just, it's fine. And then they go through this dreadful experience. She's terribly loyal, and he's very cruel back to her because all those filters have gone. But then I think by the end, it's very moving. I used to love doing that bit at the end in the bed, and they go, it's back to normal. He apologises to Lady Pembroke. is still rather upset that nothing ever happened.
Yes.
And then they get back into bed together, and it's like, there's a little hint that it's not over. Yeah, and shall we again? It just comes back, and that's just Alan's brilliant way, I think, of saying there's more to this story, without having to do the entire. But I think Charlotte, she's an extraordinary woman, and there's so much interesting stuff around her journey through the whole thing, and what she coped with. I mean, never mind him. What they coped with as a couple in terms of loss.
I think one of the interesting things about the Metropolitan book, which for all kinds of reasons now tends to be seen as have got things wrong, one of the things it gets right is to pick up the extraordinary misogyny of a lot of the accounts of the illness up to that point. So if you read the Royal Malady, one of the things that Sheridan Trent says is that, well, he had a wife who looked like a monkey. And as if that's as part of the explanation, you find that in Guttmacher too, in the sense that he must have been so frustrated in this marriage.
Well, he had no mistress.
So and at least one thing they did do was call that out.
Yeah.
Because she has that, the Queen has that, I can't remember the exact line, but something like, if you keep me away from him, she's like, you're trying to return the king to his true self, but
how will he know what it is?
How do you know what it is unless I'm there? Because none of you knew what he was like before this began. So she's incredibly loyal, really, to everything that she goes through. And I think you're right, Martin, that last final scene when they're reunited in the marriage bed, and it mirrors the scene that they had right at the beginning before it kicked in. And he has a little momentary flicker of something, and I think she must know that what's coming. But I think she'll stay loyal again. They didn't see each other for the last 20 years of their life, or something, 10 years of their life? 10 years of their life?
But you know what, I'm just curious, you say because the filter, he turns on her and is cruel because the filter. But what you've said suggests another possibility, which is that, you know, actually we do live ourselves in other people. And the people that are closest to us, they carry parts of us. And it may be that in turning on her, what he is really doing is turning. I mean, that is one of his most vicious ways of turning on himself. You know, by attacking this woman who is integral to his sense of self.
Yes.
So anyway.
So I think we perhaps start to begin to move towards the end of the conversation, I suppose. So just going back a bit to the historical context, and I think the question was to ask you, the big others, just think that here we have this very famous case study of mental illness, because one of the odd things is a case study where the name is known rather than just being an anonymised case study. And we know a lot about this particular story as an 18th century story. But did you want to treat it as an 18th century? So obviously it's in costume, yet in all kinds of other ways. It was a highly theatrical performance, it was gender blind, it was casting all kinds of very interesting things about the way you approached it. So was this a timeless piece for you, or was it a situated historical drama when you were putting it on?
A little bit of both is the answer. Yeah, is the answer, because I think if you're going to mount a revival of a production, you're probably doing that because you think it still speaks to the present day. But some of that is not spoon-feeding that to the audience. So actually you can allow the contemporary audience to draw their own parallels with how it speaks to our society and to their lives. So I suppose you've got to treat it within, I mean, you know, what you're looking at, it's a bit like Shakespeare, isn't it? When you're dealing with a play that was written in a certain century but is actually located in a different century, and now we're watching it in a different century. You know, there's all these different filters that we're viewing it through. And even just since Alan wrote it, the discussion around mental illness has moved on hugely. Mark, we tell a story about you, Simon, actually.
Oh, God.
When we started working on the play, we at the Nottingham Playhouse, we have an agent for change who comes in and talks to us about diversity and disability and accessibility of our work. And we had a talk on day one where we talked through the terms that maybe we would use to describe the illness. And we all sort of pussyfooted around that a little, didn't we? And then Simon, the expert, came into rehearsals and used all these words that we were carefully avoiding. You know, which is really interesting because, you know, and actually Alan, you know, we've got to be, yeah, it was interesting, and when we had post-show discussions with the audience, people wanted to talk about their own lived experience of mental illness. So in answer to your question, it's all of the above. You're sort of treating it through everything, actually.
I think that's the definition of a great play, or a timeless play, you know, and sometimes it goes in a sort of like a fallow period, and then someone just rediscovers it and just, oh my God. I mean, there are always odd things because it's a living, breathing thing, but sometimes something becomes acutely relevant for 5 minutes and then just goes away again. But my favourite bit was just because of, I mean, nothing's changed, but there was a particular period towards the end of the run when it must have been, so it was Theresa May just got in, I think, and I'm being dressed and I'm recovered, and Pitt comes out, and I literally just say, "What of Europe, Mr. Pitt? No one has mentioned that yet." and then 2 years later, it got about half, and then it settled down again. But I think it was the checkers weekend. It was just like it was just put it in.
Well, you also did lift it out a little bit.
but of course, if you're thinking about themes in a play, any that's the great thing with art. That's what art does at its best. You know, you don't have to stick a flag on it. You just find stuff in it, which is always there, and is sometimes achingly relevant. Sometimes you feel, you know, and then sometimes you find a piece and think, I think actually this might not be worth doing anymore. Quite a few Shakespeare's, I think, because they're sort of, you know. But other stuff, it just goes in a sort of cycle. It's really interesting. I think what I'm saying about the discussion around mental illness is, you know, this. I hope we don't get to a stage where this play has to be called The Mental Illness of George III, because you have to think about it in its context. You have to think about the prejudices of the time. You have to think this is what they called it. So we mustn't get too sort of pejorative about the past in that sense.
Also, I mean, I noticed on your website, just when you showed it, you said he's the most famous mental health patient of the 18th century. He's certainly not a mental health patient. I mean, you know, we have these euphemisms, and most of them don't really like them.
Yeah.
And you know, he had a mental illness. We have a mental health act, which is really a mental illness act.
Yeah.
That's what it is, and we can change the words, but we don't change what my friends in the military call the facts on the ground. I hope it'll never be called the mental health of George III, because that is nonsensical.
Yeah. Well, so could you follow that up by just telling us, just reflecting a little bit on what can we take from the historical record about the case of George III? I mean, you've written about it. You're one of, well, all right, I don't read that many psychiatrists.
Very wise.
But you know, what's interesting to me is that when I do read you tend to historically, you contextualize lots of diagnoses, you know, so people who historicize autism or people who historicize, you historicize PTSD, various things. Do you think, even beyond that historical context, are there things we can take out of this historical record about George III that really inform us?
Your point's well made, and I'm quite scathing of colleagues who go around diagnosing PTSD in Homer and the Iliad on the basis that an epic poem in the oral tradition that isn't written down for 600 years are actually medical case notes. George is lucky because he's got 100 volumes of medical case notes, but it's still dangerous to do that, because although at least there are records which until the middle of the 19th century barely exist for many of these things, even then, when you've been using words like sensibility and things like that, we don't have in modern psychiatry. They don't mean what we think they mean, and even words like mania and fever and depression certainly does not mean what we think. But we can at least do a bit better with 100 volumes of it, and there's sufficient, particularly the descriptive behaviours, that if I was ever to make a diagnosis historically, which I don't, but if I ever were, I think I would probably agree that that is mania. It's only in the 19th century when the Germans kind of get hold of medicine and it starts to come together a bit, and that words start to have some meaning. And even in the First World War, people now say, oh, shell shock is what we call PTSD. No, it bloody isn't. It's a completely different disorder. That's why psychiatry is so interesting and the rest of medicine is so dull. Because our disorders change with culture.
Yeah.
They absolutely do.
Well, certainly physical complaints, of course.
Well, they do a bit. They do a bit.
Fever in the 18th century is certainly not fever now.
I know, I'm teasing you, but yeah. But it is true, they do.
So if you had to say, what are the most interesting or most salient things we can take from the historical record of George III's case of mental
Well, I guess two things. Number one, it's certainly, if you're going to get severe mental illness, it's better to be well off, and it probably still is now. I would say that. And that, and I guess also, I actually, well, talking again, I haven't talked about it for a couple of years, but is how clear it is that his doctors were poisoning him. And we need to be ever careful on that. You mentioned the tics that you saw in the mental hospital opposite you. They were almost certainly caused by people like me giving drugs that make those tics. And unfortunately, we don't actually do that now, but we do other things.
Yeah.
We do, and we will always do other things.
It's important to point out they didn't think they were poisoning him.
No, of course not. And nobody goes into work saying, I'm going to poison a patient. You know? Well, Harold should. most doctors don't do that. But it turns out they are doing that. It's not a question of do you, just a question of how much. And is it still more beneficial than not?
I mean, I think even, of course, what's interesting is that contemporary practitioners are ambivalent about some of these treatments. You know, they're sort of, some people will recommend purging of blisters and others less keen on it in certain cases. And, and we're kind of moving away from, in this period, moving away partially from that kind of heroic interventionist kind of approach as we get to the later 18th century, and a slightly more kind of let nature take its course kind of approach to these treatment of physical disorders. Although there are things like bleeding go through cycles. There's a bleeding mania again in the early 19th century.
But that's why homeopathy appears in the 1820s and 30s. The brilliance of Arnold, he knew that everything we gave made you worse, therefore he gave you nothing.
Yeah, and that was actually a reaction to heroic therapies.
Yeah, and he knew what he was doing. He wrote about it absolutely specifically. You have to give them something, it's better to give nothing.
I mean, it's interesting to me actually about the context of Bellet's play, because it's kind of written at a time when the kind of social history of medicine is kind of coming, to sort of, fall into its full flower. And clearly Bennett was a man who had historical training and had maybe was going to have a career as a historian at one point, and is sensitive to it. But it's interesting, the way it views 18th century medicine to me is still that kind of slightly piss pots and, uroscopy, and there's that kind of slightly wry, isn't it a bit ridiculous 18th century medicine. And so as a historian of 18th and early 19th century medicine, I'm always kind of slightly uneasy about those representations as kind of playing for laughs.
Yeah.
Just poo jokes, really.
Yeah, exactly.
It always works.
There's a lot you can learn about peasant health through poo.
So I think one question, in some ways I think I direct a bit to Barbara and Mark about George and his relationship with mental illness and what we think about that. Because when he recovers, do we think his understanding of this, he feels he's susceptible going forward? So is this something that's going to come back? And I'm just struck by what you're thinking about religion, Barbara, because one of the things that strikes me reading George III on all kinds of issues, not just mental health, is just how strong his belief in providences. And my guess is the way he dealt with this as an experience for him was to say this was meant to be in some sense, that he had a sense that things happen for reasons which were beyond the ken of man, and you just live with it, whether it's an assassination attempt or the loss of America or the loss of your own reason. These things were part of a grand divine scheme, and actually that was part of his coping mechanism. So do you think he has a sense of vulnerability about this, or is it resignation from?
I couldn't say about George because I'm not well acquainted with him. But I think one of the things that I think is very interesting about the later period, which we just touched on, which is the emergence of the so-called moral therapy. And moral needs to be understood that it appeals to the mind and the emotions. It's not so. It's different. It's set against. Yes, it's set against the physical treatments. Is that they were driven by the idea, very, very important idea that purveyed by Enlightenment thinkers, that all human beings had a sort of core of benevolent, sympathetic instincts or a fundamental part of the human character. And whether that was seen as instinctual in some eras or had different, I mean, there's a range of ways of thinking about that. But there's a part of every human being which is never destroyed. Even in gross insanity, it's never destroyed. And sometimes that's religiously understood, other times not at all. I mean, in the writings of David Hume, Adam Smith, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, this has no religious, and yet these are, and what, and moral therapy is the idea that you can galvanize those parts of the self, you can work with those parts of the self. And that seems to me, in many ways, to mark a truly revolutionary moment in thinking about subjectivity, about the potentials for change in people. And so I think, I mean, George, I have no idea whether any of the, I mean, I don't think that's the brand. I think Willis's brand of so-called moral treatment was much more, I mean, the famous, stare. I mean, kind of terrorizing, emotional terrorizing of people. But so I think, but the development of therapies that began to address that sense, and that brought with it a different kind of respect for people, which is very marked in some of the moral therapies that developed in the in the late 18th and 19th century, and then of course get sabotaged, I think, by and large, by the rise of the great asylums and so on.
I mean, it's interesting that it's possibly no coincidence that moral therapy's greatest proponents in England are Quakers, and who see the light of God within everyone and can never be extinguished. And so there's that sense that there is a divine spirit in there that can be redeemed through these kinds of
although of course Connolly is all, but anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. And others do it too, and come from different angles. And all interestingly, the chicks also use that kind of fixing of the gaze, but in a slightly different way. They talk about it slightly differently from the way Willis talks about it, perhaps. But there are still, I mean, obviously Foucault would see elements of that kind of internalisation of kind of shackles in both kind of.
I knew we'd get there.
We could discuss with Foucault quickly.
Wonder how long it would take.
Yeah, the very end. I'm wearing a turtle.
Pendulum swings.
I don't want to end on Foucault.
But you were going to
Well,
ask
I
Mark
think that,
so
yes,
there we go.
but I think the religion thing is very interesting because, again, it's a totally different age. Religion is so much part of everyone's life, and for the king, the head of state. I think to cope with the loss of the children, to cope with the loss of America, to cope with his own madness, I think it's absolutely, he just has to think, well, maybe I'm Job with a crown on, maybe this is how it is meant to be. Otherwise, he would genuinely lose everything. I think it must be very much what David Cameron was like in his little shepherd's shed.
Oh, I hope so.
I think he has to believe that he did the right thing.
Oh, well.
I think it's probably like, well, if you want to go to the other extreme, it's like Blair in Iraq. I think they have to cling on to this absolutely irreducible thing. I was right. Otherwise, they would go mad. And actually, for George III, I think there's probably, well, God says so. Oh, well. And that is something that we, hundreds of years later, we simply have no concept of how much that was part of everyone's life. That it's just God's will. I mean, it's terrible, but look, it's God's will.
I think you see that particularly with just one document we have. It's one of our exhibitions where he's just survived what feels like an assassination attempt, and he arrives at Parliament and everybody's saying, and he's the calmest person there, because he's quite clear. If you survive, he was meant to survive. If you hadn't been, then that was it.
It's the reason that religion is still such a powerful crutch for a lot of people, because it is all you've got. A lot of people have got. And if you really believe it, then it's very powerful. It must be. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, everyone around him was panicking, and he's going, well, if it was meant to be, I wouldn't be here, but I'm fine. Hello, I'm the king.
That's a better place to end.
Goodbye.
Well, I think just to say, I think this time to draw the conversation to an end. I realise if there are any questions, I'm sure loads of people will have questions. That is partly why we have the reception, which is a chance for us to make sort of ask our own questions, and everybody in the room is invited to join us just outside behind this room, where there will be drink and refreshment of other kinds. And
questions.
Questions.
But behind a velvet rope.
But I think I'm sure everybody would like to join Caroline. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.